What is pink? A rose is pink by fountain's brink. What is red? A poppy's red in its barley bed. What is blue? The sky is blue, where the clouds float through. What is white? A swan is white, sailing in the light. What is yellow? Pears are yellow, rich and ripe and mellow. What is green? The grass is green, with small flowers between. What is violet? Clouds are violet in the summer twilight. What is orange? Why, an orange, just an orange. That's Christina Rossetti's poem Colour, and a huge welcome to the very first episode of Stories in Colour, a new podcast from the National Gallery in London, mapping how colour has transformed the world. We're going to take you through the secret histories of colours from prehistory to contemporary pop culture, and on the way we're going to stop off to look at art from our collection and beyond. Join us as we study the visual impact of humanity's efforts towards making colour and making meaning with it. One of the most ancient, vibrant and influential of technologies, colour has built empires, inspired international espionage, kick-started modern chemistry, shaped fashions, gone viral, and, of course, been deeply intertwined in the history of art. Today, we're starting at the very beginning to ask what colour is and how we see it. And we ask a very age-old question: are the colours you see the same as the colours I see? I'm Beks Leary from the digital department here at the National Gallery. And with me today to answer this question and more is Professor Anya Hurlbert. Huge welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really fun to be here. I'm so pleased you're doing this series.
We're very excited about it. So for our audience, I'll just introduce you briefly. Anya's a Professor of Visual Neuroscience and Dean of Advancement at Newcastle University. Her research focuses on visual perception, how and why we see what we see. She was a Scientist Trustee here at the National Gallery from 2010 to 2018. And she also worked with us on our 2014 Making Colour exhibition, which some of you may have seen, bringing together art and science to explain how artists overcame the technical challenges involved in creating colour. So we'll start with our first big question, which is, what is colour and are colours real?
Colours are certainly real, but they are our personal possessions. Each one of us creates colours in our own mind. Therefore, they're not something that is out there that's physical, tangible, a property of the external world. They're a thing which we create in our own minds. But inasmuch as everything in our mind is real to us individually, colours are real.
So how is it that we see colour?
Colour starts with light. Pretty much everything in life starts with light. Light first interacts with things in the world, surfaces, objects, materials. Those materials then interact with the light and reflect light to the eyes. The eyes take in that light, and our eyes have different types of light sensors which split up the light that arrives into the eye in different bands, in different spectral bands. We can call them red, green, and blue. And from that first stage of taking in the light spectrum from things in the world that reflect light, the eye constructs a signal that it sends to the brain. The brain is actually where our perceptions of color are constructed, from those initial signals that the eye has done some initial processing with.
So there is some objective reality going on here, but the color in itself is formed in the mind.
Exactly. And color tells us something so important about what things are made from, how ripe a fruit is, how old a bruise is, whether that coffee cup is mine or yours. It tells us also metaphysical things. It tells us what political party somebody belongs to. It tells us what the nature of some particular book is. It can tell us information about objects which we can apprehend very, very rapidly. And on the basis of that quick assessment of something's color, we can decide what we want to do with that thing.
So everything you're saying is saying that colour has been and is really important to humans, not just from an aesthetic point of view, but perhaps even in our evolution. There was an American physiologist called Matthew Alpern, and he said, colour is one of the hobbies of the human retina, and the important business of the eye has nothing to do with colour. And I think from what you're saying is that you would strongly disagree.
I would strongly disagree. I mean, it's so fascinating because in vision science and also in art, the debate has raged for centuries about how important colour is. You know, you can think of it as sort of just an add-on, something like something that you color in after you've drawn the important outlines, and that in a sense that might be what our brains are doing as well. You know, we're picking out the strong boundaries of objects which tell us what their shape is, and that's incredibly important, or tells us where they're located in space, and that's also extremely important, or tells us how fast they're moving, and we need to know that if we need to get out of the way, for example. And when you're trying to get out of the way of a raging wild animal, it doesn't really matter what color it is. You just need to know sort of where it is and what direction it's heading. So a lot of vision scientists, therefore, have focused on those elements of the things we see. They've focused on their shapes, their forms, even maybe their texture, their motion, and where they're located in depth. Others in vision are equally interested in color, or would argue equally for the importance of color. But Matthew Alpern was not one of those. There's also a meme in vision science that color is just too hard.
Too hard.
And maybe Matthew Alpern just found it a little too difficult to grasp.
I like that. So you referenced red, green, and blue, and we have lit up the studio for those watching on YouTube.
It's delightful. It's wonderful.
In the red, green, and blue. Could you tell us a little bit more about how that shapes our colour vision?
Yes. So you talked about evolution and the importance of colour to us throughout our evolutionary history, and that's also true of other animals. Each animal has their own set of light sensors in the eye, and they differ between different species. And we humans are somewhat limited in terms of the light sensor types that we have in the eye. So our eyes, the receptors in our eyes, sort of divide up the light signal into these three chunks: the short wavelength, middle wavelength, and long wavelength bands of the visible spectrum. So that's the sort of blue, green, and red. And that's an absolutely key step in the way we see color, because doing that enables little processes in the eye and beyond the eye in the brain to compare how much light there is in each of those different wave bands. And that is really the crux of what's going on in seeing colors, is to work out how much energy there is in the red bit of the spectrum versus how much energy there is in the green bit of the spectrum, for example, is what enables us to find a reddish fruit against a green background, and not confuse a cherry with a leaf. And critically, not to confuse a shadow lying on a leaf with a cherry. So the distinction between that light and dark is not enough to tell us which bit is the fruit and which bit is the leaf. We need the distinction between the different parts of the spectrum that each of those things are reflecting to the eye.
So it's about the contrast between those colours being registered rather than them kind of adding up almost.
Yes. Well, it's about the difference between them at sort of one location. So that's a fundamental part of what we call color processing, and we call it opponent processing, where at particular locations in the scene, the difference between how much light is reflected in, say, the long wavelength versus the middle wavelength part of the spectrum, the red versus the green, tells you something about the type of material that's reflecting that light. So that's an essential opponency to work out what the properties of the reflecting material are. Then we also have spatial contrast, which is a bit different, where the difference between those differences, over space, makes certain things look more salient than others. So the red cherry against the green leaf is really pops out in visual search, for example.
Okay.
But at each location, we're doing red versus green, and then we're comparing the red versus green in the different locations. So you have opponency and contrast both going on.
And because of those 3 colour receptors, does that mean that there's a finite number of colours that we can see as humans?
That's such an interesting question. It's limited. I mean, first of all, it's limited because we can only see wavelengths between 400 and 700 nanometers. That is, and when I say we can only see, our eyes can only respond to those wavelengths of light. Bees can see from 300 nanometers to about 650. So they can see in that ultraviolet range from 300 nanometers to 400 nanometers. So in that sense, you would say they have, superior color vision because they can respond to light of different wavelengths that we cannot even begin to apprehend.
Does that help them find the flowers or something?
Yes, exactly. Yes, because flowers do have reflections in the ultraviolet range, so they can see patterns which we can't see. The world would look. It would be wonderful to be able to see the world as a bee does.
So you've mentioned bees. I've seen TikTok filters that are trying to imagine what somebody's dog can see, and they are discovering that they might like this toy rather than that toy because of the colours that they're seeing. Are there other examples of animals that have quite different colour vision to humans?
Yes, absolutely. And while dogs might not be able to see all the colours that we can see, on the other hand, bees, birds, butterflies, and mantis shrimps are able to resolve many more different spectral signals than we can. However, when we talk about the fact that, for example, the mantis shrimp, instead of having only 3 types of light sensors in the eye, has 12.
Wow.
12 dodecahedron color vision instead of trichromatic color vision. The mantis shrimp can see the difference between 2 wavelengths of light, which to us would look the same, just sort of lighter or darker. The question is, what does the mantis shrimp do with those signals that are coming out of its eye? And I would wager that the mantis shrimp, wouldn't be able to sort of say, like Christina Rossetti, that's a lovely shade of violet, which is the color of the clouds at sunset. The mantis shrimp doesn't, he can't talk. Anyway, the mantis shrimp is very, very limited in terms of what it can do. Basically, the only thing it can do is hit you very, very fast. It's a very aggressive animal that just is designed to see something and then strike it or not. But so it doesn't have language. But on the other hand, it also doesn't have the ability to conceptualize color.
It doesn't have the brain power.
It doesn't have the brain power, but it has the spectral resolving power. It's sort of almost like a spectral radiometer. It can say there's different amount of energy in this part of the spectrum than that part of the spectrum on a much finer scale than we can do. But it's okay because we can build spectral radiometers, so we don't, we can compensate in other ways.
Okay, so we've kind of worked out how our brains are processing colour. Are there differences in how the colour is seen and made out there in the world? So, for example, if I'm looking at the sky and I'm seeing the sky as blue, what's the difference between that and, say, I had a blue mug and that is blue? What's the difference between how the colour is being made or
that's a really,
there?
really important question. It's a really important distinction. So the blue mug is blue because of a pigment in the surface of the mug, which absorbs light of particular wavelengths and reflects light of other wavelengths. The blueness of the sky is created by the scattering of light that ultimately comes from the sun, but travels through the atmosphere and bounces off little atmospheric particles, which can be molecules or dust or other particles. And the short wavelengths of light are scattered most. So they're scattered around, bouncing around in the atmosphere, creating this very sort of diffuse, non-directional blueness to the sky. And that's different from a pigment that is a physical substance applied to a surface, which is located in one space. So we call it a surface color, and which is absorbing the light that strikes it and then reflecting some of that light back.
And presumably that's also why there are very different colours on an artist's palette to there are colours in the rainbow, for example.
Because the artist is limited by having to use physical pigments. And I think this is one of the most fascinating things that artists do, is with their limited palette, their limited range of finite number of pigments, they're able to recreate sky color, which is a diffuse void color created by scattered light. They're able to recreate reflected light from surfaces, pigment, but they're also able to recreate things like metallic sheen or iridescence. And those are very different types of visual perceptions, which are created from different types of physical processes.
I think this is a good point for us to take a little break. So yeah, we've got some way into understanding how we see colour. And after the break, we're going to look a little bit more about something we've already touched on, which is how the context affects how we see colours around us. Welcome back from the break.
Thank you.
So we're going to have a little look now at how colours are affected by the context that we see them in. And we'll use a couple of paintings as examples of that. But yeah, I wonder if you could just explain a little of the context of that, of how opposite or opponent colours are embedded in the way we process colour.
If I have a spot of light in the void, in complete, utter darkness with nothing else around it, I can completely predict what that spot of light will look like to you based on how much energy it has in the red, green, and blue parts of the spectrum. However, the moment I put anything else around that spot of light, I can no longer predict exactly what you will see, because the colors you see at any one location in, let's say, the image on your retina will depend on the light signals all around it. They will also depend on the light signals that have just been stimulating your eye. They will also depend on all the light, all the colors, all the experiences you've ever had in your whole life.
Wow.
For example, a little gray square against a gray background will look gray, but if you change that background to green, that little gray square will now look pink.
Wow.
Because of the interactions between the light coming from the gray square at that point and the light coming from its surround. And that's a really fundamental phenomenon in color perception called simultaneous color contrast. Simultaneous color contrast is the thing that every artist who's ever worked with putting paint on a canvas has had to think about.
Absolutely. So should we look at some examples? We've got two from the mid-19th century here from our collection. We've got J.M.W. Turner's Fighting Temeraire and
Britain's favourite painting, I believe it was voted as.
Yes.
Yeah.
A very popular one. And The Skiff by Renoirs. So let me describe these paintings just briefly so that people can imagine them if you're listening. So The Fighting Temeraire, Turner's painting, shows the final journey of the Temeraire, a warship which played an important role in the Napoleonic Wars at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. So the ship is being towed by a paddle wheel steam tug along the River Thames, where it was to be scrapped. And so the gunship is painted delicately in these light tones and seems to almost float on the, well, it is floating on the calm waters. And it has quite a almost ghostly appearance. And we've got this blazing orange and reds and yellows sunset, which fills the right third of the painting. And the sun sits not much higher on the horizon, the lights all reflecting off the calm water below. So I guess the predominant colours are blues, whites, oranges, yellows, browns. I'm sure lots of people are familiar with it as the nation's favourite painting. What's going on here with the contrast in the colours?
That blue-orange contrast is one that's deeply embedded in the psyche. And it was deeply embedded in Turner's paintings. This isn't the only one in which you see that fundamental opposition. he, as a child, used to love to lie on his back and just watch the sky. He said he would then go home and paint the clouds, and his aesthetic experience turned into a monetary one because he got paid for these paintings. So the whole thing was a complete circle of pleasure and reward. But he did love the sky and its shifting shapes and its shifting light. And the fundamental feature of daylight is that its color varies along this very regular trajectory from orangish to bluish. So that opposition between bluish and orangish is embedded in our natural world. And Turner, in a sense, sort of absorbed this and reflected it back in his paintings. It's a fundamental dimension of the way colors are processed in the brain. We talked about opponency in color processing in the brain. We talked about red versus green. There's also the opponency that we refer to as blue versus yellow, even though those terms aren't quite right. If you look at it more closely, it's a little more sort of bluish versus orangish, but it's another way to think of it is sort of cool versus warm. But it's built into the way our visual systems process color, and that in turn, many of us think is a result of its natural occurrence in the natural world, in daylight, for example.
That's an amazing way to think about Turner's paintings. I'd always realised the blue and the orange. I would think I would describe them as complementary colours.
Complementary colours is another term to use for opponent colours or contrasting colours. And in fact, I mean, it's almost a better term because I think to imply that they're somehow antagonistic to each other is wrong. But putting a deep blue band down, as Turner has done, between those two swathes of orangish shapes enhances both the blue and the orange. So they are complementary in that way. They are enhancing each other by being juxtaposed. They're not fighting with each other. They're not antagonizing each other. They're not, coming to blows. They're trying to, I think it's fair to say, because I'm, sort of anthropomorphizing the colors, they're sort of saying, let's each strengthen each other by putting ourselves next to each other. So Turner is putting them next to each other to bring out their individual qualities more powerfully. So in that sense, you can call them complementary colors. The same term is used for that. Sort of another way to think of them is they're on opposite sides of the color wheel.
Yes.
The fascinating thing is that Turner didn't sort of have a color wheel. He had his own way of describing the relationships between colors. He arranged them in a sort of triangular form.
I find this fascinating that, artists through history really have kind of almost foreseen the science that we're going to discover later through their very complex understanding of colour. And I love that we can understand, this really fundamental opponency or complementariness of blue and orange as being, something very deep in nature coming from the light through the day. That idea of the light through the day is not something that I had contemplated before. The other picture, which does orange and blue again, but in an even brighter and more vibrant way, is Renoir, Pierre-Auguste Renoir's The Skiff from 1875. So we're moving deeper into kind of modern art, into Impressionism here. And this, I guess, is doing the same thing, but he's kind of emphasizing those colors to a point beyond naturalism here. The blue is so rich and bright. And then you have two women rowing this skiff, this little boat on the water, which is very bright orange. And you imagine that's probably, wooden in reality. And you've got these dots of orange around the rest of the painting as well. And a blue house in the background, blue sky, greens of some vegetation in the background, and all of the light interplaying in these brushstrokes that are very visible that he's set down on the water. Is there anything that's changed, that's different, I guess, in the period between Turner and Renoir?
Well, the pigments that were available.
Yes, of course.
Absolutely. That certainly is what drove a lot of the innovations in the painting techniques of the Impressionists, was the arrival of synthetic pigments. But also, I think, in the fact that there was an increasing drive to be more expressionistic in the painting, not just representational, of course. But I'll leave that to the art historians, and just again note that the vividness, the depth, the saturation of the colors in that painting are even stronger than in Turner's usage of the same complementary colors. And again, the effect, though, is to make each one, I would say, more pronounced than it would be if it were on its own. And this complementarity of the blue versus orange, or the cool versus warm, is something that, again, it's so powerful in terms of creating a response, drawing the eye to it, and engaging all of those affective and cognitive processes that you don't just see it in Turner and Renoir. Now you see it in practically every Hollywood movie poster. And it's so much so that it's now called the teal orange meme, and it crops up everywhere.
Okay.
Both, film critics and art historians and vision scientists have written reams on this use of the sort of the teal orange combination.
Well, I had a blue and orange wedding, so now I'm thinking.
Oh, did you? Right. So you were just.
Now I'm thinking that I'm just, like everybody else.
I'm sorry. You're just.
Gosh.
Yep.
I thought I was so
Your color
individual.
combinations are universal, absolutely universal.
We open with the Rossetti poem, in which she associates certain objects with certain colors.
Yeah.
And she says, we know that grass is green, but is grass green? Even if it's, your typical British lawn and it is a green variety of grass, is it always green? Why do we see it as always being green?
Well, it's interesting. You didn't ask why do we call it green, because that is, you might argue, a different question. And it gets at this notion that some of our ability to sort of categorize colors, which is what we're doing when we say the grass is green, we're putting it in this category of green, which includes many, many other colors that we can distinguish from each other. It reveals that what we're doing when we see colors is not just discriminating between slightly different light signals. We're also then grouping certain of those phenomenal experiences together and putting them in a category, conceptualizing them as a category, and then relating that category to objects in the natural or artificial world, and then linking that to a linguistic term which we use when we talk to other people to try to convey to them what's going on inside in our heads. Again, this is why I find color so fascinating, because it is actually the perfect example of how all of those interior neural processes and then mental processes act to deliver us our sense of self and consciousness, and then enable us to communicate something about that to another person. And that's what we're doing when we say the grass is green. We're trying to sort of capture, what is this experience I have when I look at that grass? Well, it's it's a multi-layered experience of spring freshness, the desire to go outside, the smell, all of that. But all I'm going to say to somebody is the grass is green, because that is kind of a label that I'm putting on that interior.
And we'll say
experience.
that even when it's quite dark, right?
Even when it's quite dark, or even when it's got brown patches on it, we might say, or when it's overgrown and we might be thinking, I need to go mow the lawn. But fundamentally, the grass is green captures something fundamental about it, which describes our sensory and perceptual experience.
And is this what we're calling colour constancy?
Well, now that's quite a different thing. So why, and that's a sort of a different question. Why we use the word green to describe that experience of this thing that is reflecting more light in the middle wavelengths than other wavelengths, and grouping it with a lot of other objects that reflect light similarly. So we're calling them all green. But what if the light changes and the light reflected from the grass changes? Do we still call it green? And the answer to that is yes. That's a slightly different question. The answer to that is yes, because we have color constancy.
Okay.
Yeah. So
let's get into it.
Yeah, let's get into color constancy, because that, I think, it's the core of color perception. So going back to what we were saying earlier, color means so much to us, and we ascribe so much meaning to color, and we use color to decide whether we want to eat that banana or not. Is it yellow or is it brown? We use color to decide whether meat is fully cooked or not. Is it still raw red or has it turned slightly brown? We make those decisions on the basis of color. But we can only do that if we believe that color is an honest signal about the material. And we can only do that if we're not tricked into seeing particular colors because the light has changed. We can only do that if the color we see is an accurate representation of the material and not just irrelevant signal created by a change in the illumination. So if I see a greenish banana, I want to know that green is due to the banana being slightly unripe and not due to the fact that your lovely studio lighting engineers have just decided to switch the lighting in here to green. I do not want to be misled by an extrinsic to the object change in the illumination. So in order to be able to extract the invariant material properties of the object from the light signal recorded by the eye, we have this thing called color constancy. And as Helmholtz back in 1860 said, colors are meaningful to us in that they represent properties of objects. And we must therefore discount the variations in illumination in order to see those meaningful properties of objects. So Helmholtz and others at the same time recognize the fact that the eye and brain together are doing something remarkable in eliminating differences in illumination, which might obscure the color signal from the object.
Okay. And then artists, I guess, have responded to how light interplays with objects at different times of day. So we might think of Monet's series paintings as an example of that.
Perfect example, yes. So Monet was fascinated by the changes in light reflected from objects at different times of day. And his series paintings, for example, the Rouen Cathedral series, his haystack series, where he returned to the same site repeatedly at different times of day to paint them, reveal really striking, dramatic changes in light. On Rouen Cathedral, we see it in one painting as tones of violet and mauve, in another, tones of golds and yellows. And yet it's the same cathedral, it's the same sort of beige stone, which to us, if we were standing there looking at it at different times of day, would appear to be that same sort of beige stone.
We'd still call it beige, even though our eyes were registering the light
stone, yes,
in a different way.
But Monet's sort of almost switching off color constancy to reveal the changes in illumination. And there's a way that artists do that, of course, which is using reduction tubes viewings. So if you view a point in space and eliminate the view of everything surrounding it, you can sort of switch off those processes I described that cause the appearance of something to change because of interactions with the surround, if you eliminate the surround. And so by reviewing bits of, say, the cathedral wall, I'm not saying he did this, but through a reduction tube, you could capture and then recreate with pigments the actual color of the light coming from that stone. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, I think this is a good point to take another little break.
Okay.
We've looked at color constancy and how the context of how we're seeing colors changes how we perceive them. And after the break, we're going to talk about a controversial viral color moment. We'll leave you guessing what that might be. Welcome back from the break. Now, we set this up before the break that there was a viral colour moment actually in 2015, so 10 years ago, that made thousands of the people on the internet question, maybe for the first time, how we all see colour. And this was the blue and gold dress. What was this dress? And why did people feel so strongly about it?
Going back to the beginning, I said color is our personal possession. And one doesn't like one's personal possessions taken away. And what happened was when one person said, I see that it's not blue and black, it's white and gold. And you're absolutely convinced that it's blue and black. Your very grasp of reality is being challenged. Yes. Someone is trying to remove from your worldview everything that you think about it. Well, maybe not everything, but everything you think about that particular dress. So it's a direct challenge on the belief that our perceptions reflect the reality of the world. But it also drove home like no other visual illusion any of us scientists have ever dreamt up or any experiment we've ever done. It showed in just one image that went round the world just how important individual experience is in seeing color, just how subjective color is. It sort of had all of the puzzle and the mystery and the excitement of color perception in one image.
So we have this picture of a dress. Was it about 50-50? People saying,
exactly,
this is blue and black, and then another 50% of people saying, no, 100%, this is white and gold.
Exactly.
And people could not agree.
They could not agree
on what the quote unquote real colour of this picture of a dress was.
Yeah, looking at the same picture, whether on their mobile phones, whether at a computer screen, people looking at the very same image had very different perceptions of this dress. And I just showed it to my class in psychology yesterday and asked them, what color did you see it the first time you saw it? Half of them said white and gold. The other half said blue and black. Age dependent, they were all about, 12 when they saw that the first time, 8. And it's person dependent because of the fact that color is this thing that our individual brains create from a multi-layered set of processes that start with the light signal that hit the eye, but are influenced at every stage by multiple factors, including our previous life history, our previous perceptual experiences.
What team were you? Blue and black?
I'm afraid I was white and gold, and I was adamant about that. I said, A, I'm a color scientist.
Yes.
B, I like fashion. And so, of course, if I say it's white and gold, it's white and gold. There was just absolutely no question there. I do have the dress. I bought it online, and I have recreated the illusion in with the 3-dimensional dress and a set of lights in an otherwise sort of dark tint, have brought people in to look at the actual dress under particular lighting conditions. And again, 2 people looking at that same dress, one of them will say it's white and gold and the other one will say it's blue and black. So it's not a phenomenon of the photograph alone. It's a phenomenon of the light signals arriving on the eye and what the brain then does with them.
Wow. Yeah. So is the dress actually what color is the dress?
Well, no, I can tell you what color everyone will agree it's a particular color under certain lighting conditions. So humor me and let me just say a little more about this because I said that color constancy is core to color perception, and I think the dress really drives that home. The reason why people see it differently is because their color constancy mechanisms work differently. The photograph is ambiguous. It's not something that can be immediately extracted with certainty from the photograph, from the RGB values of the pixels, what is material and what is lighting. And so each brain has to do a quick computation and subconsciously work out what the illumination is and sort of factor it out, as we discussed that's what we're doing all the time when we're seeing objects. We're working out the material of the object and discriminating that from illumination effects. So those people who see the dress as blue-black are effectively interpreting the image as created by a blue-black dress under sort of bright yellow lighting. And that combination would create those pixel colors in the photograph. Those people who see it as white gold are seeing the dress material as white gold and the lighting as a sort of dim bluish lighting. And that combination would create the same RGB values of pixels. So subconsciously, the different brains are filtering out different assumed illuminations. And when you have the real dress and you put it under a bluish light and a yellowish light simultaneously, you can create the same effect. So some people sort of discount the bluish light, other people discount the yellowish light. And the actual dress in the photograph was most likely under two different illuminations, a bluish light and a yellowish light, which brings us back to this notion that we've got embedded inside our brains this understanding that daylight goes from bluish to yellowish or bluish to orangish. So we understand that lighting can be any one of those colors along the blue-orange line. And therefore, when a picture arrives in front of us or an image lands on our retina and it's got this bluish, yellowish range, we can sort of pick any one of those as the likely illumination. That's what creates the ambiguity.
So is there any way to measure this? So, for example, I'm standing in front of Van Gogh's sunflowers. We've got the lovely, beautiful, yellowish tones of his sunflowers. Is there a way to measure how yellow I'm seeing those sunflowers compared to somebody else standing next to me?
I can't really get inside your brain and experience how yellow you're experiencing that. So no, I can't really do that. I can't work out whether you're seeing the same yellow as somebody else. But what I can work out is whether the way you see colors is this sort of the same as the way somebody else sees colors. I can't ever get at the actual phenomenal experience you're having when you're seeing colors, but I can do that by having you take two different light stimuli and adjust them to look equal to you, so they look the same yellow to you. And then I can bring in another person and have them look at those same two spots, which are made from different light combinations, but look the same yellow to you. And I can ask them, do those two things look exactly the same to you? And that person, if they say yes, I can say, well, okay, so the processes in your two brains are probably very similar and you're having similar, resulting experiences. But if the person says, no, they look very different from each other, I know that their whole way of seeing colors is probably different from your way of seeing colors.
And I guess there's a category of person that we describe this as color blindness, where they see very differently.
Exactly. And interestingly, it is yellow that is a color that's very important in enabling us to discriminate between people with different types of so-called color blindness, because there are many different types. And they come in different degrees of severity as well. And one way to diagnose the type of color blindness that a person has is by asking them to match a monochromatic light, which looks yellow, to a mixture of red and green lights. And the particular mixture that they choose tells us what kind of light sensors they have in their eyes and whether those light sensors are different from a normal trichromat's light sensors.
And men, I think, are much more likely to be colorblind than women. Why is that?
Exactly. 8% of men have some form of color blindness, or as we prefer to call it, color vision deficiency, or even better, just variant color vision, because it turns out that actually there's a pretty wide range of different types of light sensors that people can have in the eye. But the reason why males in particular, 8% of males have this color vision deficiency, is that the gene that codes for the long and middle wavelength photoreceptors, the red and the green photoreceptors in the eye, that gene lies on the X chromosome. So when there is a mutation in that gene that makes an anomalous photoreceptor, and it's given from the mother to the son, the son does not get another X to compensate from his father. He only gets a Y, piddly little Y, that the father gives the son. So he doesn't have any way of balancing out that mutation on the X chromosome. So it will get expressed. And it might be that the mutation was such that he's missing completely the gene for the green photoreceptor, the middle wavelength photoreceptor. Or it might be that there's just a shift in the sensitivity range of that middle wavelength receptor. Now, a female who inherits that anomalous gene from her mother can get an X from her father, which has the normal gene, and then she'll express the normal gene and be a so-called normal trichromat, have the normal red, green, and blue photoreceptors. But she still has that anomalous X chromosome.
Right.
So she's therefore a carrier.
Yes.
And her son, therefore, might exhibit this color vision deficiency.
Makes sense. I've also heard rumors that there are some women who have extra color vision. Is that true?
We were just talking about them. The carriers now have got the normal gene plus the anomalous gene. So if that anomalous gene is coding a slightly different, let's call it a slightly different green photoreceptor, they can have the normal green sensitive photoreceptor and then this anomalous one, which is sensitive to a slightly different chunk of the spectrum. So they've got 4, because they've got let's call it a blue, short wavelength, the normal green, the shifted green, and the red. So they've got 4 photoreceptors. So they should have 4-dimensional instead of 3-dimensional color vision.
And practically speaking, does that change how they see the world?
Well, this is the sort of million-dollar question. Does it? They might have it. They might even express it. But do their brains then use that extra piece of information? And this is a pretty deep question, which is being directly asked by several labs around the world. Premier one in Newcastle University, my colleague, Gabby Jordan. She has searched for the needle in the haystack by really carefully examining the perception of women who might be 4-dimensional color vision creatures. So we call them tetrachromats. And she has found one needle in this vast haystack, one person out of hundreds who does seem to have this superior color vision, who does seem to be able to use this extra dimension. So they're rare. That's the short answer. Extremely rare.
Extremely rare. So we're coming to the end of the episode and we've just got a question from the audience. So the question that was asked by one of our subscribers on YouTube was, does one color change when I see it next to another color? And I think we've already answered this. So I'm going to change it a little bit. And I'm going to ask something a little bit more gallery specific, which is, does the color of the wall in a gallery change how we experience or perceive the colors in a painting? And the same question about the lighting.
And short answer is yes, it does. The colors of the walls can enhance or subdue the colors in a painting. So Degas' painting of, I think it's La Coiffure, which is pretty much an all sort of reddish. The hair. Yes, the combing of the hair. There's so many reds in that painting are wonderful. That really stands out if you put it against teal walls. So if you put it against the sort of complementary color walls, you enhance the warm, deep reddish colors in that painting. And that, in that sense, the colors of the walls can really make colors stand out more, but it also can enhance by exaggerating their meaning, by exaggerating their salience. But I also want to say that the walls can change the lighting in the room too. So if you have white lighting in a room, but reddish walls all around, in fact, the reddish walls will be absorbing all the short wavelengths of the lighting and just reflecting back the long wavelengths. So effectively, they're changing the lighting as well. Now, does lighting on its own affect the colors that we see? Well, if the lighting varies in such a way that's similar to the way it varies in natural daylight, because of our color constancy mechanisms, which evolved under natural daylight, no, there shouldn't be so much change in the colors we see in the paintings because of color constancy. We can compensate for those changes in illumination. However, in today's world, we have a fantastic array of artificial lighting, which allows us to sort of sculpt the light spectrum in very unnatural ways. And using those new light sources, for example, multi-channel LED light sources, which are have many different bands of light emission, and therefore we can actually boost some wavelengths more than others. We can change the lighting in ways that our visual systems just can't quite cope with. And that color constancy fails, and then the colors in the painting do change. That was actually one of the things we illustrated in the cinema exhibit, part of the Making Color exhibition. We used spectrally tunable LED lights shining on a Gauguin painting to illustrate changes in the in the colors of the object. So we changed the lighting in a subtle way, and people reported different colors for the fruits in the painting.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I will ask just once again about the dress. Can we say for once and for all whether it is?
You really want to know, don't you? What did you say the first time you saw it?
Blue and black.
Okay, well, yes. If I took the dress and put white lighting on it, I'm afraid everybody would agree with you. It is blue and black. Yes.
I'm right.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So that does bring us to the end of our very first episode of Stories in Colour. If you're listening, please do subscribe if you've enjoyed this conversation and want to discover more stories about how colour has shaped human history. We'll be looking at a bug that turns the world red, the world's first modern synthetic pigment, discovered entirely by accident, why we think of purple as a royal colour, and so many more stories. We really hope you're going to join us on this journey. And you can also discover more about the science of colour and how art materials are made on the National Gallery's YouTube channel. If you've got more questions about the story of colour, you can email us. We're on podcast@nationalgallery.org.uk, or you can send us in questions via our social media channels at National Gallery. Just mention the podcast, and we will try our best to answer some of those questions for you in our next series. So thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of Stories in Colour, with huge thanks to our guest, Professor Anya Hurlbert. I've been your host, Beks Leary. Our producer was Harry Rosehill. Our researcher was Hannah Rogers. Our technicians were Ian Warren and Timothy Carpenter. Our video editor was Jan Kenyon. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next time.